So we can begin?
I was just getting started. I'll wait.
Okay, all right. We're going to begin now. I want to go through probably one of the most influential discussions on aesthetics that have ever been developed from the evil side of the figures is the discussion on the birth of tragedy. This was developed by Friedrich Nietzsche in a very influential work, which was the basis for the Congress of Cultural Freedom's whole aesthetic theory, or what we call modernism, right? You'll see and you'll recognize a lot of what Nietzsche said, and you'll find out how absolutely explicit our enemies are in terms of their hatred of Socrates very specifically, and a very fundamental idea of the nature of the human species. Nietzsche wrote, as I said, this a thing called The Birth of Tragedy, which was basically dedicated to Richard Wagner. And in The Birth of Tragedy, he says that tragedy comes from essentially what was called the Silenian myth, and that it's an ancient myth which says that essentially they catch one of the satyrs and tie him down, and they say, "What is the secret to life?" And the satyr says, "Best you were not born, but if you were born, die quickly." Right? And therefore Nietzsche takes that Silenian myth, which was the basis for the bacchanalias, the Bacchic orgies that dominated certain cults inside Greece. And he says that actually tragedy emerges, classical tragedy, or tragedy, birth of tragedy, emerges out of this Bacchic dancing, and essentially his view was that since there is no truth, that the universe ultimately is not only unknowable but irrational, right? That the Bacchic orgies, the willful, the exercise of the will is all that humans can do, right? In other words, they can dance, and that the Bacchic orgies, where they lose their sense of individuation or individual existence, you know, which the spirit of dance and these Bacchic orgies, you lose any sense of individual existence. What happens is, out of these Bacchic orgies, your senses become so sated, so impossible to control, that you negate these orgies, and an individual, right, steps out of this orgiastic total immersion in senses, right? And that individual is what he identifies as there's what they call the Dionysian, which is the Bacchic orgies, and then there's the Apollonians, who reject it, right, as a way of asserting individual will against this total loss of any sense of identity in total pure sensuality. That individual who negates that will, who negates that idea of loss of individuation, is the basis for the first actor. That's what he says, Thespis, right? That out of these orgiastic dancing, right, an individual emerges, and he was the first actor. And that the first artist, what he defines as Promethean, what Nietzsche defines as Promethean, is the idea that the individual asserts their will arbitrarily against the orgiastic domination of their senses, and they assert their will arbitrarily, and that's what makes them Promethean. Hmm? Because that's all there is. That if you assert your will, then you are shaping the universe. And that by shaping the universe, you become the Promethean man. And there's a very explicit anti-Semitic side to this thing, right? Because they said Jews don't do that, but Aryans do. This is what Nietzsche says. I'm not saying that, obviously, but this is what Nietzsche says. I'm Jewish myself, so this is pretty obnoxious stuff. But that, you know,
Actually, I don't think it's anti-Semitic because one of his best friends, I think, Richard Wagner.
Wagner was one of the worst anti-Semites who ever lived.
But he was Jewish.
No, Wagner was not Jewish.
Well, I believe it was a composer. I forget.
Yeah, but no, he is explicit anti-Semitism. I can read it to you in the.
But he even stated that he hated the fact that Germans went that route.
No, Nietzsche did not. Wagner did not either. No, you just have, historically, you're just wrong. I have the quotes. They talk explicitly about how Jews have this effeminate side, whereas Aryans assert their will. Now, this is obviously untrue. It's nutty, but this is what. But if the universe is completely irrational, which is what he asserts, right? Then the only thing that a human being, and it's very much, by the way, something that Descartes says, right? What do I know? I know my senses. I know that I know. Or I know that I don't know. But what I do know is that I know something. Even if I know nothing, that's something. I know this sounds absurd, but this is. But if you don't accept, if you start from the standpoint that the universe is irrational, you are left with the assertion of the individual will as what he defines as Promethean or the Superman. And he writes later in Thus Spake Zarathustra and other writings that the Superman becomes, of course, the Hegelian. It's a development beyond Hegel on this question of the end of history, right? That in fact the Supermen define history through their will. This is Schopenhauer. This is Nietzsche. This is what leads to Schwarzenegger. This is what this is, okay? But it starts from a fundamental assumption, which, by the way, starts with Aristotle. These guys are not that new, because Aristotle asserts that while the universe may be rational, there may be a creator, right? It's unknowable, because you're finite, the creation is infinite, therefore that even if you develop up to a certain point, hypothesis up to a certain point, you cannot know with certainty the nature of the universe itself. And therefore you're opening up the door for a universe that is completely irrational. It starts with Aristotle, then later gets developed through the German critical philosophy with Kant and Hegel and Feuerbach. Marx diverges on a certain level with Nietzsche. They're contemporaries. Marx and Nietzsche are contemporaries, right? But it's all this philosophical radicalism. And that the assertion that Promethean man is the irrational assertion of the will against the fundamental irrationality of the universe is their idea of art, is their idea of how tragedy emerges. That the individual tragedian is asserting his will, but he understands the fundamental nature of the universe is fundamentally unknowable and irrational, and therefore that in fact in this you'll be shocked. In this piece, he defends Hamlet explicitly. Right? He says Shakespeare was a brilliant tragedian because Hamlet said it all. Ultimately, there's nothing you can do. Right? No, this is explicit. Okay? And that he also asserts, which is very interesting to me anyway, at the end of it, there is a diatribe against Socrates. He said Socrates killed tragedy. right? And the way that Socrates killed tragedy, and he's very explicit on this question, it was sort of breathtaking, right, is because Socrates asserted that the nature of the higher hypothesis, right, the generation of higher hypotheses, of higher powers, right, essentially allowed the universe to be acted on in a knowable way with a knowable outcome, right? And therefore, Socrates killed classic tragedy. That's what he asserts, because he got the core of tragedy is in fact human beings are tragic. Human existence is tragic, right? Because there's no, it's existential, right? There's no way you can know what your actions are on the world, but you can assert irrationally those actions, and that's the artist, or the art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. You've heard that, right? Art is entertainment. It's the assertion of will. Art for art's sake. There's no or the famous split between art and science. Art is the assertion of the will. Science is the manipulation of certain things, right? And there's no relation between art and science. This is where it comes from. This is where the Congress for Cultural Freedom and all modern critiques, all modern ideas of art, right, come from this Nietzschean discussion, which he later develops in other places, but comes from the birth of tragedy. Unfortunately for Nietzsche, he chose about the worst subject he could have chosen to prove this point. Because, and by the way, he was a classical Greek scholar. He spoke ancient Greek. He read Plato in the original and Socrates in the original. He read all the original plays in Greek. Right? He was going to be the one of the linguistics professors at a major German university. Right? So therefore, he was highly trained. Why did he do it? He hated Socrates. He hated Socrates, and he says so. He hated the philosophical optimism. Right? It was not just merely, I'm going to give the class, and then you can ask questions. Because I am going to give the class. Right. Yeah, right. It's hardly Semitic, right? But the point is that the only reason you would, all of you have read some Socrates. Some of you have fallen in love with it like I have, right? The beauty, the power of it, in terms of the nature, particularly in the Apology and the nature of the human soul, right? And what he asserts there. How can you be human and not be moved by that? Nietzsche, in reading that, in the ancient Greek, asserts his irrational will against that. And says there is no human soul. There's only human suffering. Right? By the way, he died in a mental institution smearing feces on the wall. So it didn't. That view doesn't have a good longevity. Okay, I mean you're not going to end up that well with that view, right? But the idea that he chose classical tragedy to prove his point that what the greatness of Greece is that they were prepared to accept, as Aristotle did, that fundamentally the universe was unknowable. That power to accept that the universe was unknowable and create despite that, it was he asserts was the power of Greece and was the power that created classical tragedy. That's what he asserts, right? And on some level, if you don't know the answer to that kind of thing, it sounds sort of romantically powerful, right? I mean, really it does. I'm not kidding about it. That's why it's alluring. It's not just stupid. It's evil. And therefore it has a certain allure to it, right? Rational, yes, there's nothing, and I can assert my will, and there's something because I asserted my will, right? And this, by the way, is Milton's Paradise Lost. The evil Satan does this kind of thing. And this is the question of hubris, right? The question of assertion against the gods, of the power of the individual will. As I said, what we're going to do tonight, what I'm going to say tonight, has never been said before. But the truth of classical tragedy is the exact opposite of this idea. The exact opposite. As I said, he couldn't have chosen a worse subject to try to prove this point. Because classical tragedy does not emerge out of Bacchic dancing and the individuation of Bacchic dancing. There are names attached. You see, this is where this bullshit of coming up with fantasies about how things work that sound credible. This is historically specific. Classical tragedy was created by Homer, right, in the Odyssey and the Iliad, but particularly in the Iliad, right, and the return home in the Odyssey. Homer, in turn, there was a dialogue between Homer and Aeschylus, who creates the famous Promethean, actually, the play Prometheus, right? He has three of them. We only have one of them. The second one, in fact. The first one is Prometheus the Fire Bringer. The second one is Prometheus Bound. The third one is Prometheus Unbound. We still have to write, I think Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound. We still have to write Prometheus the Fire Bringer. It still has to be written, right? But this dialogue, which I'm going to show to you tonight, it's irreparable. They can't refute it. Therefore, they lie about how classical tragedy came about. Homer was viewing the collapse of Greek civilization. After the fall of Troy, in which the majority of the young men of Greece were sent to war for no apparent reason, right? This was a stupid war in a stupid place at a stupid time for no reason. And after the fall of Troy, there was a loss of all ability to write. The beauty of their written language went, their pottery went, everything went. There was a dark age that ensued after the collapse of Troy. Now Homer, like Dante Alighieri, was viewing disparate tribes who were terrified, who, when they came back, which is the story of the Odyssey, when they came back from the Trojan Wars, all the young men who didn't go, it was a 10-year war and it was 10 years in returning, all the young men who were too young to go, or the old who were too old to go, right? The young men who had no fathers, who had no tradition, had taken over the islands that they were returning to, which is the story of the return of Odysseus to, I believe it's Ithaca, right? Which he was the king. And his young son, who was the heir apparent, because they thought he was dead, could not take his rightful place because the young men who didn't go to Troy, who were now 20 years older, had seized the island, right, and put Odysseus' wife, Penelope, under house arrest until she would be willing to marry one of them, any of the suitors. But the young man who should have been the heir apparent to the throne was not capable of taking the throne because the suitor said, "You take the throne, you're dead." And he didn't have, and the old men who were left could not defend the right of his son to actually take the throne, right? This was going on all over Greece at the time. So there was a breakdown of authority, there was a breakdown of culture, there was a breakdown of an orderly process of government, right? And Homer, in viewing this dark age, as Dante Alighieri in viewing the dark age, said, we have to comprehend what the heck happened here. Right? And we have to come up with a better way of thinking about this. right? In order so that this doesn't happen again. And he also did, since the Greek tribes hardly had different languages, they could hardly communicate with each other, by writing a great, and he didn't write it really, he sung it. This was interesting. This is about 3,000 words, or 3,000 pages of a poem, which was sung, and was sung again and again at festivals, which was in cities and towns across Greece, about the story of Troy, so that you would create a common history, a common language, and a common moral purpose or mission to create Greece. Greece did not happen by accident. First of all, if you've ever seen Greece, it's a rocky, hilly, unhospitable place. It really is. It's not a great place. I mean, it's very picturesque, but you couldn't do farming there. It's not what you would choose. What made Greece great was that they adopted a more profound idea of man and a more profound idea of culture, about the nature of man. But it was not an act of irrational will or happenstance. It was a very specific project launched by Homer in trying to bring people back from a dark age. And Homer writes in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and just to give you a sense of the unbelievable power of these poems, right? How does the poem start? The Iliad. It starts basically, sing, heavenly muse, of the rage of Achilles. That's how it starts, right? It doesn't start, in some didactic way. Achilles, they go to Troy to try to, get back Menelaus' wife, who was stolen by Paris, right? So they go to Troy to try to get her back. And they launched, is this the face that launched 1,000 ships, right? This is, of course, the famous line by Marlowe on Troy, right? Well, actually, it's in Faustus. But anyway. Okay, so the question becomes, that's not how it starts. It starts, Achilles is about to kill Agamemnon, the chief of the Greek forces. Achilles, the greatest hero of the Greek forces, because Achilles' concubine was stolen by Agamemnon. Now here they're going to Troy because Menelaus' wife was stolen by Paris and taken to Troy. And how does the poem start? They're about to kill each other because Agamemnon stole Achilles' concubine. What an irony. Where's the moral high ground that the Greeks have? Right? In other words, Agamemnon, first, they're about to kill each other. That's how the poem starts, right? And then I'm not going to go through the whole poem. It would take several weeks. But the point being, there's a very compact power of composition, a very compact irony in the beginning. Right? Now, you're talking about something that was written 900 BC, or sung 900 BC. And the power of composition in 900 BC starts with a total dramatic irony. Think about it. He could have told the story and then build up to it, and people might have been interested or not. No. It starts with the rage of Achilles. Of the rage of Achilles, sing, heavenly muse. He's evoking the gods so you can understand what the hell happened. What happened in this war? And ironically, when Achilles is met later in Hades, he has an underworld scene. It's quite something. When Achilles is met in Hades, Achilles said, "I wish I didn't fight this war. I wish I was alive today." Which, by the way, it's better to be alive and a coward, he says, than the way we killed each other. Achilles says that in the poem, which, by the way, is quite wild because in the Republic, Homer gets attacked for Achilles saying that, which is very interesting, right? There's some very interesting things that go on in the Republic in the way that this poem was discussed. But anyway, so it starts with this very powerful irony. Now, later on, at the end of the Iliad, right, you get into a very, very ironic situation because the gods of Olympus, right? Now remember, these are all these Greek tribes, right? They're standing there, or they're standing around, sitting around, listening, right, to this poem. So what's the first scene? The great god of Olympus, right? Zeus. First scene with Zeus. Achilles is pissed off, so he leaves the battlefield. He doesn't kill Agamemnon, but he says, "I will not fight." And he begs his mother that she goes to speak to Zeus, to ask Zeus to bring disaster on the Greek tribes. He's a Greek. He sails with Agamemnon. He prays to his mother to go to speak to Zeus and to convince Zeus to bring disaster on the Greek tribes so that they would beg him to come back. Okay? The great Achilles. So, what's the first scene? The high and mighty Zeus is standing there in Olympus, and Achilles' mother grabs him by the knees and sues him and says, what's the first words of Zeus? I'm not kidding. The first words of Zeus are, "Get up. If my wife sees you, I'm a dead man." Right? I'm going to get killed. Get up. I'll do it, but just get up. I don't want my wife to see Hera. She's very, very jealous. Right? And I don't need this, okay? So, fine, I will do this to the Greeks, but get up. And so Hera, unfortunately, does see this, right? So Hera tries to convince, and this is very Shakespearean, by the way. Hera tries to convince her son, Hephaestus, who's he's a blacksmith. Achilles stole fire. Not Achilles, I'm sorry. Prometheus stole fire from Hephaestus. But he's a hunchback, right? From doing all this work. So she tries to convince her son to attack Zeus. And her son says, "Oh, hey, that's great. The last time you convinced me to do this, and I was stupid enough to do it, Zeus grabbed me, whipped me 3 times around his head, threw me down. I fell for a month, and I landed on the Isle of Lesbos." I'm not kidding. Right? I'm not going to do that again. Right? And then he says, and then he makes a fool of himself, literally, and says, "Let me serve some drinks." And then he starts hobbling around and serving ambrosia to all the other gods, right? And they all start laughing at what a fool he is. Right? But, okay, now, you think Homer's making a mistake? He's not making a mistake. He's not. He is very explicit. While the gods of Olympus are they cannot die, their very immortality allows them to be immoral. Because nothing can happen to them. No matter what they do, they cannot die. They don't feel pain. Well, they do feel a little pain, but they cannot die. And therefore, they have no sense of any purpose in life. And while they can rain disaster on mankind, there's this incredible scene. Zeus wants all the Greeks to get destroyed until they beg Achilles to come back. He agreed. So anyway, Hera, who's pissed off at Zeus, decides, well, she's going to side with the Trojans, right? So in order for the Trojans to win, this is all in this poem, and everyone's listening to this thing, right? She decides that she's going to put on the belt of Venus. She's going to seduce her husband, Zeus, behind a cloud where he can't see what's going on the battlefield. So while she seduces him behind the cloud, with this belt and all these other things, the Greeks are getting slaughtered. Just wiped out. And then Zeus wakes up, and says, "Holy shit, what the hell happened here?" And then he, so he comes back and he tries to, and the Greeks start winning, right? Now, is that a mistake from Homer? No, it's not. It's not. He's making some very interesting, ironic comment on the nature of the gods of Olympus. While they are omnipotent and while they cannot be, they may not be omnipotent, but they're immortal. While they are immortal, they are not good. They are not motivated by the good. They're motivated by irrational will. Okay? And therefore, they may do good for man, they may not do good for man. It's all how they feel. Really. I mean, that's what he's saying. Okay. Does he support that? He does not. Homer does not support that. And in fact, you get this very interesting irony at the end, where the men, Achilles, kills Hector, finally, right? And the father, Priam, has to get his son's body back from Achilles. Okay? Now, Priam, who's an old man, realizes if he sees Achilles, because Hector had killed his best friend, Achilles' best friend, and Achilles will not be at all placated. He drags the guy around he drags Hector around this tomb 3 times. He tries to desecrate the body. He can't desecrate the body. He's full of rage. And Priam, who's an old man, is supposed to get his son back, right? And he begs the gods, and the gods say, all right, we'll get you through the line. And Priam meets up with Achilles. And Achilles was given a choice. Either he leaves Troy or he will die at Troy. Priam is also told he will die at Troy. So they finally meet, the old man and Achilles. And he says, look, you have a father too. This could be you that you're dragging around here. And I'm an old man. Give me my son back. Give me my son back. I have to bury him. I have to do honors. And you have a father too, and this could happen to you. And what would you do if your father came? If I was your father and you were me, what would you do? Right? And Achilles relents. And he actually says, and they both know they're fated for death. And the two of them break bread together. And they sit down, and Achilles says, there's enough time for weeping, there's enough time for crying. Okay, my rage is slaked. We will sit and break bread, and you will bury your son. I will give you your son. The war will stop. So the men actually emerge in some sublime way beyond their fate. Both of them are fated to die. They both know they're going to die. And Achilles says to Priam, there'll be enough time for that. We sit now and we break bread and we eat together. Right? And a Greek audience watching this thing, if you can imagine, right, would say, well, the gods are irrational. The men, while they're not omnipotent or omniscient or anything like that, they seem to be noble. They are capable of some nobility. Right? And that's sort of how it's very complicated, but that's sort of how the Iliad ends. But what's interesting to me is in the Odyssey, which is the return home of Odysseus. And this is a very important development in Greek society. What Homer develops in there, and I'm not going to go through the details of it, I'll just give you a little bit of taste of it. What Homer develops is this idea that Pallas Athene, who was the goddess of justice and wisdom, right, who was the only pantheon of the gods who actually emerges, Homer explicitly, she's the one who guides the son of Odysseus, Telemachus, to find Odysseus. Right? She actually, this word mentor? Have you ever heard this word mentor?
Well,
that is Pallas Athene. Is an old man. She comes in the guise of an old man to guide Telemachus to find his father. And mentor also means this old man stands up against the suitors who are demanding that Penelope marry one of them, and actually saying to the Telemachus, "You cannot be the king here," right? This old man stands up to all the suitors and says, "You will not harm Telemachus." And then he turns to everybody and all the old men in front of all these young princes who were demanding that she marry him. And he says, "If we do not stand together, then let no man be a good king. Because if this is what happens to good kings when they are gone, then there's no point in being a good king." And the old men band together, and the suitors don't want to have a massacre on their hands, and they let Telemachus go try to find his father Odysseus, who happens to be trapped. It's a long story about how he gets back, right? But when Odysseus comes back to Ithaca, he comes back as an old man, in the guise of an old man. And there's the good shepherd. He comes back, this guy who was waiting for Odysseus to return, who had been thrown out of the city because he couldn't put up with the suitors, and he's angry. He sees this old man, a weak old man, but it's really Odysseus in disguise. And he's cold and hungry. So the good shepherd takes literally his shirt off his back. That's where this word comes from, the shirt off your back, right? And gives it to Odysseus. Not knowing it was Odysseus, just thinking he was an old, weak man. And often Odysseus is taken in because everyone says you ought to, if someone is hurt or weak or the gods spurn, if you take them in and you show them kindness, right, then you are honoring the gods. Because there but for fortune you could go. You could be that guy if the gods did that to you. Because they do these things to people, right? And therefore, by showing hospitality and kindness to people who are weak and distraught and in difficult straits, they say, well, the gods did this to people. We can't stop what the gods do. But we can act like humans to each other, right? And therefore, this idea of charity, right, this idea of the right of the stranger, the right of the weak to be defended by those who have, right, is established in this poem. And then it turns out it is Odysseus. He sort of magically reappears, right, because of Athena. And he goes, and then he disguises himself again and goes through the town and finds out who was loyal and who was not. He finds out almost no one was loyal. So he, his son, and the good shepherd go back in and take the kingdom back. But those are the only three who could fight. Because he didn't trust anyone else and he didn't want anyone else, right? Now, this gets totally... This is... The reason I go through this because there's a method of composition here which is extraordinary. It was breathtaking. After they defeat and kill all the suitors... now, the story is that when Agamemnon came home, you may know the story. When Agamemnon came home, Clytemnestra, his wife, was waiting for him, and she kills him. Right after he comes back from Troy, Odysseus goes home, and Agamemnon goes home. And I'll tell you a little more about this story. But anyway, the story is that Agamemnon is killed by Clytemnestra for reasons that I'll go through. But Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, was waiting faithfully for Odysseus when he came home, right? Even though the suitors were demanding things from her, and she wouldn't do it, right? So after he kills all the suitors, they go to the netherworld, right? And who do they meet in the netherworld but Agamemnon? And Agamemnon says to them, for all eternity, things will be said bad about Clytemnestra and what she did. But for all eternity, people will sing of the fidelity of Penelope. Right? Now, here's a poem that's gone for 3,000 pages. Right? It starts with Agamemnon. And the rage of Achilles. He's about to kill him. You meet Agamemnon at the end in the netherworld, right? Saying, what was at stake here, right? What was at stake here was the fact that you cannot do irrational things. You can't do irrational things because the result of these irrational acts led to my demise and my wife killing me. And what was this whole war about? What did we really get out of this thing? Right? So that there's a very conscious attempt by Homer to actually found a more profound idea of society through this epic poem, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, Aeschylus. Aeschylus, at least what we have extant of Aeschylus, is very interesting. First of all, Aeschylus was a Greek war hero. And what's significant about Aeschylus is that he takes the return. This was called the Orestean trilogy, which is one of the three. We don't have a whole lot of Greek plays because a lot of them were lost. But in the Orestean trilogy, Aeschylus identifies that, in fact, the return of Agamemnon from the wars in Troy and his murder by Clytemnestra, when she says it, and it's well known, that in order to launch the war in Troy, Aeschylus picks this up again. In order to launch the war in Troy, he had to kill his own daughter Iphigenia, a blood sacrifice, because the gods wouldn't let them off the island to launch the war, and in order to launch the war, they had to make a blood sacrifice. So Aeschylus takes the war in Troy and makes it even more explicit and more condensed, where he says, look, you've unleashed, by killing his own daughter, his wife, Clytemnestra, kills him for killing the daughter. And she takes on the lover Aegisthus. It turns out Aegisthus, her lover, I mean, this is really Gothic, the father of Agamemnon, the founder of the house of Atreus, served his brothers in a cannibalistic feast to Aegisthus was the only one who was alive. The other brothers were served to the father because this king seduced, or at least they thought, the father of Agamemnon. The mother was seduced by this other king. He kills all the kids and serves it to him. And Aegisthus was the only one left, right? So these blood sacrifices, right, these hatreds, these ancient hatreds, right, were ripping society apart. Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon. Then later, Orestes comes back, the son of Agamemnon, and ultimately kills Clytemnestra, right, because she killed his father, and he was told to. And then the Eumenides actually pursue Orestes to try to kill him, right? So once you unleash these genocidal cycles of revenge, right, society gets torn apart. Now, the actual warning and the ending of the trilogy, right, is when the Furies, who are pursuing Orestes for killing his mother, are turned into the Eumenides, right? They are the Furies, but they agree, under orders from Pallas Athene, that in fact if they are honored by the people of Athens, then, and in other words, you've got to stop these killings. You've just had to stop this kind of way of doing things, right? And therefore, if you recognize it is unnatural, it's against natural law, and you recognize the power of the Furies, then they will turn into what's called the Eumenides. They will turn into the good goddesses of the hearth, right? And they will defend Athens as long as they are recognized and their power is recognized, and these killings and these kinds of things stop. And so that's how the play ends. And in fact, at the end, the goddesses turn to the audience itself, the Eumenides, and says, remember us and honor us, and we will do no harm to you. Right? So it's a very direct appeal to the population at that point of Athens, right? Because Aeschylus was an Athenian writer. It was a very direct appeal to creating a society not based upon irrational hatreds. That you had to overcome these irrational hatreds in order to have a society. And that you had to recognize there was a higher law and a higher principle upon which societies have to be based. Now, this was not an accident. The people who paid for the classical tragedy, these were the first classical tragedies. Aeschylus wrote the first classical tragedies, right? The people who paid for them were the Pisistratus, right? They were the kings of Athens at that point. They wanted to create the theater as a moral institution. They wanted the theater to be an educational process whereby society, at Athens in particular, would rise above the level of bestiality. It was very conscious. There had to be a resolution of this way of dealing with things, which tore Greece apart. Greece was destroyed by the Trojan Wars. And I'm not going to go through the details of it. I have it, but I'm not going to go through the details. But Greece was destroyed by the Trojan Wars. And therefore, in Homer, and then later Aeschylus, they take up how are you going to resolve this problem so that we can live as a society. And what they do is they develop through a dialogue form, the beginning of a dialogue form, right? Because these things occur as dialogues, literally dialogues, right? How do you present these ideas in a compelling way so that you can create Greece? Greece was not a place. It was not a place. It was an idea. It was an idea created by poets. That's what Greece was. There was no Greece before Homer. There were disparate tribes all over the place. Backward, disparate tribes. But by presenting the tragedy of what happened when you act out of impulse, what happens when you don't think, if you don't have any higher principles. And that's why they created Pallas Athene was a creation of Homer. She was the goddess who did not go along with the gods of Olympus. She loved mankind, right? She was the one who guided Odysseus home. She was the one who later in the play, the trilogy, the Orestean trilogy, she was the one who defended Orestes. She was the one who came up with the resolution of the crisis that you cannot defy natural law, which was the Furies. When you killed your daughter, and then you kill your husband, and then you kill your mother, right? You're defying natural law. You're going to tear society apart. And therefore, Pallas Athene was a conscious creation of Homer and Aeschylus and Sophocles. I'm not going to go through Sophocles tonight. But the point is they were creating a very conscious metaphor for living words, right? A metaphor for justice, a metaphor for goodness. See, you can use the word, it doesn't mean a damn thing. I mean, these Christian fundies use these words in the exact opposite of their meaning, right? Because they're not living words. There's no story attached to it. First of all, you have to understand, Troy actually happened. It's not a myth. The British tried to say it was a myth created by Homer, right? No. All tragedy is historically specific. It does not occur as an irrational sort of, making up of things. In fact, there was a very famous archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann, who actually was the first real archaeologist. He found Troy. He found exactly where it was because he studied the poem. He knew what the hill would look like, how big it would have to be. He knew approximately where it had to be, and he dug and he found Troy. Right? So Homer was discussing very historically specific the existence of a dark age. That the impulse tendency for classical tragedy was, how do you avoid a dark age? Not how do you assert irrational will, like Nietzsche said, right? But that the impulse tendency for all classical tragedy and all classical art is a sublime idea that you had to create something that did not exist, because what existed was destroying mankind. This tribal relations, these things were destroying mankind. Not because you're making that up and you feel that way. It's what happened. It actually happened. Troy actually happened. They found the place. They found where it was. He proved that's what happened. Isn't that interesting? From the beginning, classical tragedy, issues from Homer about a historically specific incident and the necessary insight into solving that historically specific problem for that time. 900 BC. 900 BC. See, humans were always human. And the impulse tendency for classical art has always been a sublime commitment to the furtherance of mankind, not the irrational assertion of will. And the poets create civilization. Civilization is not an accretion of particulars. It's a dialogue among poets who are attempting to create a new hypothesis, living words, so that society can move forward. Therefore, to say that classical tragedy is about the irrational assertion of will is about the stupidest thing you could say. Just fact. Forget about interpretations of the thing. It didn't come from orgiastic dancing and some idiot deciding he doesn't like orgies, right? And he's going to impose his will. 3,000-page poem that sustains a long line over a 2-week period. It was sung over a 2-week period to thousands of people, and starts with Agamemnon and ends with Agamemnon. Starts with Agamemnon alive and ends with Agamemnon dead, saying something to the people of Greece. And then Aeschylus, in picking up what Homer initiated, develops it even more powerfully in a more compact way in the Orestean trilogy. And then Sophocles, which I'm not going to go through tonight, but Sophocles takes it one step further in the famous Oedipal, in Oedipus Rex, in Oedipus at Colonus, which is unbelievable. Oedipus at Colonus, which nobody ever plays. Oedipus at Colonus is one of the most remarkable plays ever written, right? Because Oedipus, who is now broken after you know what the story is, or if you don't, I'll tell you later. But you know, he marries his mother by accident, and it's a mess. Anyway, he has his daughters are his daughters are his sisters, and it gets pretty confusing. Anyway, so he's broken. He's completely broken. And then Oedipus at Colonus, in the Oedipus at Colonus, which is the second play he wrote on this theme, they want Oedipus to come back to Thebes because the two brothers who were left, who are actually his sons and brothers, I mean that's just true, they want his blessing, one of them, so that he would be the heir apparent after he left, because he blinded himself and left. And one of the brothers was going to steal him and bring him back, and he didn't want to go back. And this is amazing. And he's in this Colonus, which is the place where you worship Pallas Athene, right outside of Athens. And Theseus, the king of Athens, doesn't know it's Oedipus, but they know they're going to take a weak, blind man. The army's going to take him back, and he doesn't want to go. And he sues Theseus and says, protect me. Don't let these people take me. I have no power, but it's wrong. I do not want to go. I am at this sacred place. They cannot invade this sacred place. Theseus, the ruler of Athens, doesn't even know who the guy is, and tells Creon's forces, who are trying to bring him back to Thebes, says, you will not take, I don't know who this man is, but you will not take him. And we will go to war, if necessary, and I don't even know who this man is. But he is sued for peace. He does not want to do this. I will not submit him to your power. As long as he is in my power, you will never take him. Athens. Athens of justice. Athens of Athena. Right? So, on the one hand, there's a very clear moral point. But on another hand, the power of these dramas are amazing. Because they're classically composed. They're thorough composed from beginning to end. Right? But you take a look, and the reason I went through Homer, and you're talking about 900 BC, and the dialogue between Homer and Aeschylus, and the dialogue between Aeschylus and Sophocles to create Athens. Athens was the creation of poets. It was not a place. Yes, there was a physical place called Athens. But what made Athens great, what made the creation of Plato and Socrates, was this classical culture, which was the drama was a mass education institution, so that people would actually grow above being bestial tribes and reacting to situations without any thought of history and without any sense of where they are in history. So you cannot, from the beginning, I'm talking about 900 BC, from the beginning, the impulse tendency for all classical art was the idea of the sublime. Not this assertion of the irrational will that Nietzsche says. Art was science. Art was science. It not only had many of these art things, and particularly the the Homer, actually had astronomical things in them, as does Dante. But the point being, the impulse tendency for all great art, for all classical art, is an idea of man. It's not irrational. It's an idea of man, a scientific idea of man. How is mankind going to go further? And it's in the soul of the poet. As remember, Shelley says in the famous Defense of Poetry, the poet is the unacknowledged legislator for mankind. Shelley was discussing Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey explicitly. The unacknowledged legislators for mankind. And the classical theater, the Greek classical theater, and then later Shakespeare, who takes it, there's a whole other discussion between Plato, Shakespeare, and how that works, right? That's a whole other discussion. But you see the fraud of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's a fraud. That's what gets me about the whole thing. It's a fraud. They make it up. They say, I mean, what orgiastic dancing? Yes, they were orgiastic dancing. Yes, some guys didn't like that and they, stepped out of the orgiastic dancing because they wanted to individuate themselves. Sure, it all happened. What does that have to do with the birth of tragedy? Zilch, nothing. And then what they go on to say is, well, since that art from the beginning is this irrational assertion of the will, then Wagner is the clear Promethean after Beethoven. Because he takes Beethoven, who was a brilliant assertion of his will, right? There's no science in Beethoven. There's a brilliant assertion of his will. And then Wagner takes it one step further, and he reintroduces the idea of myth, the Wagnerian myths, the Lohengrin, and all these other things. He reintroduces on a deeper level the Greek classical tradition, or the Greek tragic tradition, through his, these several-hour operas, right? Chromatic operas. It's quite mad, right? It has dancing, it has singing, it has all sorts of things in it. Really, that is Nietzschean, right? Because there is no science to that. The science of statecraft. The science of statecraft is an old science, born in the soul of a sublime individual who loves mankind and is trying to discover how to make sure that mankind does not go through dark ages, to give them principles, broader principles, living words as you would, right, to overcome the historically specific problem. The only way you make progress is concretely. We had to solve this problem of George Bush and Schultz. It's not any old problem. Right? It's not. We don't have to solve the problem of Agamemnon, but they did, and because they did, and because they solved other problems, right? Which these tragedians and Dante were critical in helping solve, because Dante really takes the church, the ultramontane church, he just rips it to shreds. Which was the problem that they had to get out of in the Middle Ages. They had to overcome the kind of irrational fears which dominated the Middle Ages. And Dante was absolutely clear that these popes who did this to the church, who sold souls, who did all these things, these were evil people, and you had to say it. And you had to name their names, and you had to put them in hell. Right? And you had to say it. Because if you didn't solve that problem and understand what was good in the church, what was bad in the church, you could never go beyond that. And because he had the courage to do that, as Homer had the courage to attack the gods of Olympus. Homer attacked the gods of Olympus. Socrates attacked the gods of Olympus. He did. Don't kid yourself. It was extremely ironic what he did in many of his dialogues on the gods, right? So that when Shelley says the poets are the unacknowledged legislators for mankind, that is literally true. Lynn is a poet, first and foremost. He really is. You see the way he writes, right? He has a great love of mankind. If you don't have love for mankind, if you don't do poetry, don't do art, leave it alone. Just don't do it. It's just look at me. Right? It literally is look at me. Look at this, I can do this, I can do that, I can, I mean, so what? No. And therefore, as Schiller says, and very powerfully, and I understand this very well, you will not have a Renaissance without a classical theater. You won't. You won't have it. Because one of the most powerful teaching tools in history for mankind, you have to understand, Shakespeare, you know how many people went to Shakespeare's plays every day? You know how big the Globe Theater was? 3,000 people a day. That's about 50, and it was always full. It was about 15,000 people a week for over 20 years. Now that's some education. And you know that because you know when you get into trouble. Lincoln was very famous on this question of Shakespeare. He's standing in the battlefield at Gettysburg. And all of a sudden, the lines from Shakespeare overwhelm him. And he remembers whole soliloquies from Shakespeare's tragedies. Right? Because it speaks to you. These are living images. These are living words. Right? You say, I'm not going to be a Hamlet. And you know what that means. Right? It's not just a word. Right? You've lived through the experience of Hamlet. So when you say, I'm not going to be a Hamlet, or I'm not going to be a Lear, right? Because you know where it leads. You know exactly where it leads because you saw where it led, and the logic was absolutely, not the logic, but the development was absolutely irreparable. And the cumulative effect of these images, right, create in a civilization, in a population, a comprehension of what the nature of statecraft is. But more importantly, if you don't have principles, where this leads, if you don't know what you're doing, where it all leads. Historically specific, though. Not irrational, historically specific. So that is the impulse tendency. But all modern art today, all modernism, issues from this idea, this fascist idea. And I'm not going to pull any punches. There's a reason why Arnie Schwarzenegger's a fascist. Right? It's not that he's, his father was a fascist, that's true. But Hollywood is predominantly fascist. Predominantly. I'm not saying everybody in Hollywood's a fascist, but the actual view of art, that is the culture, is dominated by this idea of the assertion of the irrational will. The artist asserts their irrational will. That's called entertainment. You may like it, you may not like it, you may have different tastes, right? But there's very little historic insight into this thing, right? So that's where we are. But I think you have to comprehend that the impulse tendency for all classics, music, art, science, all of this, right, is a sublime commitment to solving the problem of mankind at that historically specific moment. And by the layering of understanding those historically specific solutions, you have Renaissance. That's how they occur. So, that's what I have. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. I know you mentioned that the Troy war in Troy actually happened and stuff. And so this made me think of this. Zeus.
Right.
Obviously, he wasn't a real god, but how did this come about with Zeus being viewed as god or any of them?
Well, I mean,
any of the Greeks.
there's historic precedent for believing that different tribes, right? It's very interesting. Keats has a very interesting discussion of this in Hyperion, right, which is a very famous poem. Hyperion, right, where there's the what you would call the Titans, right, and the Titans, according to certain in Diodorus Siculus and others, the Titans were a very advanced civilization and culture, right? Not not from space or anything like that, but they had a sense of science, and they were Egyptian, and they had a sense of spherics and other things. And Prometheus was a Titan, right? He was part of this Titan tribe, right? And these Titans came to a certain area that is now Morocco and brought their science with them and gave science and horticulture and other kinds of scientific capabilities to the people of that area, right? So a legend grew up about this tribe, right? And the Titans, they're called, right? Then apparently the concubine of the head of the Titans, Kronos, works with another tribe, the Olympians, right, and overthrows the Titans. And since Prometheus did not like what Kronos was doing, Prometheus actually sides with the Olympians initially to bring them into power, right? But then they turn on Prometheus because Prometheus will not allow them to take back the science and culture that the Titans had given to the people, right? And then they torture Prometheus. Mm-hmm. And Prometheus doesn't give in. Okay, so there's a legend involved in that. Now, the legend is different than myth. Wagner was involved in myth. Wagner, it's sort of, this was the basis for Jung. This is the basis for this Freudian psychology and other things. They say that deep within our psyche are these myths, right? And these myths repeat themselves constantly, right? That man is just a passions and irrational will, and that these myths basically are ways of explaining the irrational will of man and why we do irrational things, right? The myth of the Mother Earth, the Mithra cults, right? That life is cyclical, and that we go through cycles, and that's all. And our psyche is involved in cycles, and this is all crap, right? I mean, when mankind gets stuck, we're just stupid, right? We don't go through cycles; we just go down. We don't come back, okay, until somebody makes a discovery, huh?
You want to say there's a pattern?
Yeah, I'm saying it is not. I'm saying that's what the myth makers say there are patterns.
But if we look at history, things have repeated themselves.
No, never. You see, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up, right? No, history has never repeated itself for a lot of reasons, right? It never has. No. It doesn't. You see, that's what's interesting. That's why I was going through this historic specificity. Troy never happened again. You don't have to solve the Trojan War now. right? You don't have to solve the Trojan War now, because they had to solve it then to get another step further. They had to understand what happened to them. Once they solved the Trojan War with this, Odysseus and then a new problem emerged in the course of history, right? A new problem. Like Dante takes up this question, the Catholic Church had been taken over. It wasn't originally, it was an unbelievable institution, right, under Christ and the apostles. It was unbelievable, right? But it got taken over later. Dante had to have the courage to say what happened. Somebody had to have the courage to call the shot, to say these are the false gods, right? That is not repeating. If you never solved the Agamemnon, the Trojan War, then you wouldn't have had a Catholic Church, I assure you.
So I guess really what does repeat itself are the way we look at mankind, the principles, right?
The principles, but they don't repeat themselves. See, the principles. It's a good discussion. This is not a silly. This is a good discussion. This is an important discussion because there's an important distinction to make, right? Because this is what you're going to be taught in school. History repeats itself. Mankind, those who don't master history are condemned to repeat it. It's all bullshit, right? Mankind comes up against specific problems, okay, constantly. It takes, as I said, the poets, and I'm using poets in a very specific way. I'm not talking about guys who write in verse, right? I'm talking about someone who takes all of mankind into their soul, right, and says, what do we have to solve? And it's usually, you've got to be courageous. Dante he put several popes in hell. If you read the Inferno, there are at least 3 popes in hell. Right? One was even living at the time. Yeah, the Pope was living and he put him in hell. Now that takes a lot of courage. It took a lot of courage for Homer to portray the gods as they're powerful. They can make you do things, but they cannot break your will. And you can't blame everything on them. And you guys have to get together and actually go after, create a god of justice. They created Pallas Athene. She was one of the gods of Olympus. You want to answer a little? No, but you want to say something on this?
Actually, just the next question.
Okay, yeah. Okay, let me just finish this. But this is a very important point. It's a very profound point. Okay, once they solve the problem of the church with this, Nicholas of Cusa later solves it and others solve it and they go beyond, right? You still had a dual problem, right? They didn't get rid of this operation inside the church, the ultramontane, right, which Dante was talking about. They reasserted themselves as Venice. The Venetians, after the collapse of Rome, they went to Venice, this grouping, right? And then they morphed into the British. But it was never a repeat of history. If you don't solve the problems, you just haven't solved the problem. And Schiller, of course, takes this up in the religious wars. So it's constantly evolving. It's historically specific, right? And we have to solve the problem, the historically specific problem of Arnie Schwarzenegger and Schultz, and the fact that we never got rid of the Nazis after World War II. We never got rid of them. So, question, yeah.
Yeah.
Women.
I guess somebody's here.
Open?
Wondering, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear. All right. Gentlemen. Gerry, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question regarding Hamlet and the
Yeah.
myth behind that.
Right.
I don't know what the question is, but could you talk about that? Because I got this book called Hamlet's Mill. Apparently it's an essay by this guy, Giorgio di Santillana.
Yeah.
Or something. And it goes through the myths behind Hamlet and these other myths, how they're really based on history. I was wondering if you could talk about this.
Well, actually, this kind of discussion, the myths behind... I've read many books about Hamlet. There's a...
Don't mute it. It's muted right now.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
You guys are breaking up.
Okay. Well, the specific myth about Hamlet...
Hold on. How are they going to hear on the other side of the phone if the phone's muted?
No, they can hear. They can hear.
They're listening over the phone.
Hello?
Can you hear?
Now we can hear.
Okay, yeah, okay. No, the question of Hamlet and the myth behind Hamlet, frankly, I think that I've read several books that said, in fact, it did happen. There was such a person as Hamlet. So I don't know. You know, the particulars of that I just don't want to get into. I just don't know. The point is, it's not myth in the sense that there was a very specific problem that they were dealing with in terms of the succession of kings in this Denmark situation. So it was specific. Yeah.
I really need to know the distinction, qualitative distinction between the Nietzschean Superman and a toddler.
And a what?
And a toddler.
Okay, go ahead.
Because, I mean, you do have this phenomenon, you know, it's known universally as like the terrible twos, where you'll have a toddler and they're really impulsive and they're really sensual, almost Dionysian in their lust and desire, and they're just like a bundle of wants, and they let you know that, right? And they're very possessive, and they try to impose their will,
right,
on everybody and anything.
Yeah, right.
And sometimes people and things get hurt in the process, right?
Right.
So, but as a culture, we recognize the innocence of young children.
Do we?
Right. Well. Well, no, but here's what's interesting is like, you know, that's sort of like within the bounds of acceptance, right? I mean, like.
Well, you can't blame a kid for being immature.
We have immature parents, so they lose their temper. But I mean,
Yeah.
the way you should recognize it is, well, like, okay, the kid spilled milk, right? You don't cry about it, right?
Yeah, right.
I know parents these days are sensitive, but but when an adult does that, there's something very wrong. And what we'll do is, like, you know, someone who doesn't pick up after themselves, or someone who, you know, sleeps in, you know, because they were just having fun or reading all night the night before, and they just don't want to get up because they feel they haven't gotten enough sleep. They just don't feel like it, right? You call that childish.
Right.
But I recognize when an adult does that, I get a sense of a huge Nietzschean fuck you, right?
Sure.
And so I want to know the difference between, I mean, is there a qualitative difference, or is it just one of quantity in terms of a child, when a child does it,
well, you know, when
an adult does it?
No. You see, Nietzsche read Plato and hated Plato. That's evil. That's a calculated evil. There's a difference between a child who never read Plato, right, and therefore could not reject Plato or Socrates, and an adult who reads Socrates and Plato and rejects the human soul. It's totally different. And it's evil. That's what we call evil. That's what we call fascism. It's not just merely that they don't understand. Nietzsche was a thoroughgoing Greek scholar. He translated these things. He knew exactly what they were, and he hated them. Because it said that there was something more in the universe than his irrational will, which is what the gods of Olympus believe. That we have nothing, there is no natural law. Now, in the Prometheus of Aeschylus, he says very specifically, there's this beautiful discussion in both Aeschylus and also in Shelley, in the Prometheus Unbound. I know this from Shelley very well, Prometheus Unbound, where Shelley says very specifically, when Zeus is going to be taken down to hell, literally, the words are from the demi-organ, he rules. You don't rule, Zeus. He rules. The creator of the universe rules. You and your irrational will are nothing. It's self-destructive and you've destroyed yourself. You're finished. And this is the problem for our oligarchs today. If they succeed, they will destroy themselves. They will destroy themselves because there is a law higher than their irrational will. The universe is not created by their irrational will. It's hurt, but it's not created.
So
Yeah.
a young adult or a baby boomer
Yeah.
acts childish?
Yeah.
I mean,
If he's read Plato and hates Plato, he's an evil son of a bitch. And if he's not an oligarch, he's on the wrong side. He should get with the right people so he can go down with them. And it's very interesting though, because if you're that way, you know no beauty, right? If you're like that, you can know no beauty, you can know no peace. You live in hell. You live in hell. That's why Dante put the Pope who was living in hell. Because it doesn't. It's not like you go to hell. You live in hell. You reject that idea of man and that idea of the human soul. And you think these oligarchs are having fun? You think George Shultz has a good time? Believing that everyone else, has to cower to him? Money, greed, hatred. Great, I'd love to be a party with him. He can't read Shelley. He can't read Keats. He can't read Shakespeare. He can't, dance like an idiot. He can dance with Nietzsche. Right? He can dance to Wagner, right? Irrational, and then they wake up drunk the next morning. On the wine of deceit, as Shelley would say. Yeah.
You said that Greek tragedy from the beginning had the sublime conception of Mary. And
No, the impulse tendency was sublime, yeah.
Oh, say that again?
The impulse to create it was sublime.
Okay. Okay, because a few of us have had this discussion. I'm just wondering about the way that concept of sublime,
Well, sublime is very specific, the way that Lynn develops it, right? It's very specifically this idea of creating a higher hypothesis, powers. In other words, there's not the sublime, right? In other words, you have an anomaly. It confronts you. Like Troy was a hell of an anomaly. It confronts you. Are you now? If you're an empiricist, or you have no moral commitment to mankind, then hey, you can walk away from it. And that's what the majority of human beings do, right? But if you face that with courage, right? And there's a certain amount of agony because mankind is about to did destroy itself. It's not pretty. And you tell the story not from the standpoint of dragging people down, but from the standpoint of this, because it's not, you see, the two are one. The Iliad defines the tragedy. The Odyssey defines a new concept of man. Now, is it as developed as Plato or Socrates? No. Absolutely not. I mean, you get this breathtaking developments with Beethoven. You get breathtaking leaps. I had this very interesting discussion. You'd like this one on Archytas. With somebody who was trying to prove that Archytas was a development beyond Thales, right? Which of course he was, and he tried to explain it, but in Thales terms. And I said, you're just wrong. Did you look at that thing? That did not come from Thales. That came from the complex domain. That's where it came from. And if you try to linearize it and try to explain it as a part of the previous development, and if we get enough of previous development, somebody makes a break. Bullshit. Never worked that way. Never worked that way. I mean, the Dalian problem is a real problem. How the hell are we going to create a geometry of higher power so that we can think through the science that's necessary to solve our problems, to be more human, right? That was how Archytas came up with it. And if you try to linearize it, if you try to explain it from all the previous developments, forget it. You never get it. You'll never come close. Where did Homer come from? What? You going to tell me Homer came from what? He came from what I said he came from. He was human. He didn't like what went on. And he had courage. And he said, I will create Greece. As Lynn said in 1956. Right? When he said, there ain't no Americans left. There are none here. Everyone's run. The SWP, maybe they hung around for a little bit of a fight, but they're idiots. I can't rely upon them. I can't rely upon anyone. But I love mankind. I have my destiny, and I will create this nation based upon certain fundamental discoveries. And then in the course of his discovery, he came up with unbelievable breakthroughs, including the rediscovery of what was there, which is the American system. But when he started, it was him alone, saying these idiots don't know what they're talking about. I hate this idea of artificial intelligence. I know mankind is capable of beauty and the sublimity, and I don't like anyone saying differently. And that's where Homer came from. That's where it comes from. But you have to go against the gods of Olympus. You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared. Because if you don't do that, you will never create anything. I mean, do you know the courage it took for Dante to put a pope in hell while he was alive? Do you have any idea what that meant? The courage it takes to do that? These were powerful bastards. And they were out to kill him. He had already... You know the irony of Dante? He'd already lost the goddamn battle. When he wrote the Commedia, there was an attempt to try to see... The white Guelph were trying to seize Florence, right? Away from the black Guelph who were part of this black nobility. He'd already lost the goddamn battle. He was in exile. And he puts popes in hell. Because it had to be done. Not because he was some iconoclastic idiot. It had to be done. The truth had to be told. And then you get a taste for that kind of thing. He becomes very ironic later. Right? No, that's where it comes from. That doesn't mean people don't develop greater powers. They do. But it's based upon the previous powers. In other words, we had this discussion on this question of the dialogue, the Platonic dialogue. We were discussing the relation between Egypt and Greece. And many of the scientific breakthroughs of Greece were really Egyptian, very much so. But what did Greece actually discover that no one else had ever discovered before? Through Homer and the tragedies, right, they created a method called the Platonic method. of consciously setting up problems and undercutting the assumptions as the method by which you can develop ideas. That was uniquely Greek. The Egyptians had nothing like that. And that was the impulse tendency later for Shakespeare. So it's not that history doesn't develop. It does. But it has certain principles involved. One of them is courage. One of them is courage. The courage to stand alone and make a discovery that increased the power of mankind to go forward. Not so easy. But if you stick with it, you can have happiness. So, that's that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if somebody improves another's hypotheses, does that mean they hate them? Because you're referring to Nietzsche being an attack on Plato. And
wait, he said, have you read Nietzsche?
Yes,
have you read this piece?
I'm going to quote what I've read.
Have you read this piece? I'm not making this up.
No, but
he says Plato destroyed Greece.
Yeah, can I just elaborate a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one, Nietzsche does agree with Plato about the fact that you cannot find absolute truth.
Plato says there's no such thing as absolute truth.
Exactly, there's no such thing. The only difference between metaphysicians and empiricists is metaphysicians just believe, and empiricists inquire. Really, if you look,
no, this is academic. Forget it. It's all wrong. History did not occur that way. Nietzsche made the whole thing up. The empiricists brought mankind down. Science was not based upon empiricism. If you want to go through it, Sky has classes. We're doing a Gauss marathon. And if you're serious, rather than just trade academic ideas, you work. No, it's academic because unless you work through Gauss and Kepler, you have no idea how mankind has gone forward. This is not some academic debate from books. Mankind made certain scientific discoveries. The method by which those scientific discoveries were made had nothing to do with empiricism. Nothing. And therefore, it's not valid. We shouldn't. I mean, we can have it out later, but I'm not going to waste people's time now. Yeah.
Are you saying that human progress is only humans only progress whenever there's a problem to be addressed?
No, I'm not saying that. But there's always something to be solved. Okay. Right? In other words, we will never know all the laws of the universe. Never. We will come closer to approximations of those principles. Right? And in fact, those principles, we have every reason to believe, are developing even as we speak now. I mean, the universe itself is developing. And therefore, there are new universal principles to be discovered in the process of that. So what makes us uniquely human is the ability to increasingly know more of those universal principles and apply them to progress for mankind. And they usually come up as anomalies. They usually come up as things we don't know and are interested. Yeah.
Yeah, so Gerry, this tragedy in Greece, did it ever bounce back? Did Greece ever bounce back?
No, this was it's a very Lynn develops it in a very. There's one irony. This thing about I got to tell you about democracy. It's not a good form of government. Okay. This is the irony. Under the so-called Greek kings, the Pisistrata, right, is when the classical tragedy developed. It was funded by the kings, the oligarchs. It was funded by them. And the Pisistrata, this particular tribe or this particular family, right, for whatever reason, and I don't purport to know why, really loved humanity. It does happen. Oligarchs sometimes come up with these things, right? Charlemagne was one. Others. I mean, not every king that ever lived was a bad guy, right? Although it's a bad form of government. So the Pisistrata avoided wars. The Pisistrata never fought. The Athenians, they ran Athens. They never fought aggressive wars. It was under the Greek democracy, ironically, the ones that killed, ultimately ordered the judicial sacrifice of Socrates. Because democracy leads to tyranny. Right? They was very specific. When Socrates said, you go from democracy to anarchy to tyranny, he wasn't talking abstractly. That's what happened in Athens. Right? So what happened was that they never came back because they fought several, under the Greek democracy, they fought several imperial wars. In fact, the Solon was the king just before, or not the king, but the ruler just before these Pisistrata, right? Who actually founded the Greek theater, and they actually carried out, this particular Pisistrata carried out Solon's reforms. And under the Greek democracy, under Pericles and others, they fought imperial wars, and they were ultimately defeated and destroyed by Rome, ultimately. So they never came back. No, they didn't. Yeah, in the back.
I was just having a question about what you meant by the universe developing. I can understand how, like, human beings developing, I understand that's the principles of the universe, but I don't know, maybe I just don't have quite an idea of how the universe develops itself, or what you mean by that.
Well, there's a creative, in other words, Lynn discusses this in this question of Vernadsky, right? Where you have the noosphere, the biosphere, and the abiotic universe, right? They're all in the same universe. Therefore, the principles of the noosphere do define aspects of the living and the abiotic universe, right? There's a creative principle embedded. It's in the nature of creation, right? Otherwise, how could the abiotic universe respond to the noetic? If it was completely hermetically sealed, you couldn't have these developments, right? So therefore, the universe must be, since it has embedded in it the noetic principle, as identified by mankind, right? The universe itself also must be developing. In other words, the abiotic universe is part of the noetic and the biotic universe, or the biosphere, right? And it must be somehow developing, because it was created. So there are other principles involved. It's also getting more complex. Rather than winding down, it's getting more complex. So anyway, yeah.
Aren't you locking yourself into a sort of dualism then?
Go ahead.
I'm asking, is this a dualistic philosophy that...
No, not at all.
How is it not?
Well, what do you mean?
Aren't you setting a clear delineation between the sphere of knowledge and gnosis and the sphere of the abiotic universe?
No, absolutely not.
Where?
Absolutely not. Because mankind can intervene in the biosphere, as he does all the time, by creating bridges, by creating roads, by creating fertilizers, and is actually enhancing the principles of the biotic universe and of the abiotic universe.
But
appropriating it for the powers of mankind.
You're making it a requirement that these two separate universes exist by the fact of the existence of the divinity?
No, they're not. They're not separate. In other words, they are what they. Let's put it this way. This would take a whole discussion of Riemann. They're multiply connected. Yeah, they're multiply connected, right? In other words, they're not hermetic. There's not a. We only use words in a certain way, right? We say, okay, there's an abiotic universe, right, which has different principles, energy principles, frankly, than the biosphere.
Yeah.
The different energy interchanges in the abiotic and the biosphere.
So aren't the divisions between them illusionary?
No. Because all of it is defined, right, by a noetic principle.
The
entire universe is defined by a noetic principle. In other words, this is the problem that Aristotle really goes crazy about, right? He says, well, look, change is the only way you can comprehend. Change as a principle is the only way you can comprehend the universe as a whole, because it would be dualistic otherwise. Certain things change, certain things don't. It doesn't work that way. The actual abiotic universe, and Vernadsky talks about this very specifically, mankind can create new elements. We can create new elements. We can bombard with neutrons and other things and actually create a new element. We can create new strains of plants. So if these were all dualistic, or if they were not capable of being subjected to a noetic principle, then you couldn't do that, right?
But your proposition is that the existence of a noetic principle indicates divinity, or...
You can call it what you want, but yes. If you want to call it that, that's fine.
Is that to be taken for granted?
I think the universe was created, yeah.
Okay.
And the way I know that, though, I don't just think that, I know that, is because of the nature of how creativity in mankind is capable of affecting both the biosphere and the abiotic universe. Because if we were not capable of doing that, suppose I thought it was true, but every time I did something, it turned out badly, right? Or, in fact, one of the effects of the noosphere is that mankind has increased the relative potential population density. In other words, we aren't winding down. The universe is negative entropy. And that's rigorously provable in terms of the numbers of people on the planet, the ability of the planet to sustain it. So it's not dualistic.
I wouldn't quibble with you on that point. I was just curious about whether or not I was to take that as a given. Because Descartes' entire discourse on
metaphysics.
Yeah. But, I mean, he's trying to logic out that process. And
it doesn't work.
Fails.
He fails miserably. because it's not a logical process. Yeah, if you have a different question, we're not going to debate Nietzsche.
You mentioned that democracy is not always the perfect system.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you felt about aristocracy, because as much as I love Plato, I noticed that he fought the counter-revolutions against democratic Athens for the rule of 30, which was his cousins and his uncle were involved, and his parents were descendants of aristocrats. And if you look in his philosophy, especially the Republic and his last and longest writing, which was the Laws, he sets a lot of standards that are aristocratic. I mean, they're just state-owned. And I was wondering if you felt that's the right system.
I would go at this in a different way, because there are certain, again, the actual great experiment with a republic is America, right? There have been advances beyond Plato. But he identifies a principle of law which is the standard for this republic. In other words, in the dialogue with Thrasymachus, where Thrasymachus says might is right, where he attacks Socrates, and Socrates tears into ribbons in the course of that discussion, right? Socrates said, no, the good. There's a principle of the good. And this coheres with the nature of man. And therefore government must cohere with that nature in order to be valid government. Whether he carries it out in the particulars totally correctly, I don't think he does. I think there has been advancements beyond Plato on that, but not in principle. See, we don't have a pure democracy. Our country is not a democracy. It's a republic. No, it's a republic. It's a totally different idea. In pure democracy, whatever the mob says is law. We say we don't give a damn what the mob says, right? Law is law. Truth is law. Goodness is law. Progress is law. The general welfare is law. Not the rule, the irrational rule of a mob. I don't care whether they have the power to do it, and they often did. In Athens, they did have the power to do it, right? But the question that Plato raises is the question of law. That there is a natural law, there's a higher law, and that's what you're dealing with. So in principle, Plato's right. All his particulars in the Republic, I think we did it better in America.
We have a question in Oakland.
Oakland, yeah.
Hi, Gerry. This is Cecilia.
Hi, Cecilia.
I wanted to ask you about Athena.
Yeah.
And, you were talking about Homer created her.
Yeah.
In the Timaeus dialogues, it says that she was imported from Egypt. And
yeah, she was. Yeah.
Imported into Greece by Solon.
Right.
I was wondering, if did Homer and Solon exist at the same time? If they did they collaborate? Did they build?
No, Solon was 300 years after Homer.
After?
Yeah, Solon came 300 years. Homer wrote in 900, or composed. He didn't really write it. It was later written. He composed in 900 B.C. Solon was 600 B.C. So he came 300 years later, Solon. But the point was that I'm talking about living words. In other words, the goddess Athena was Neith of Egypt, which was thousands of years before Homer, right? But when you talk about when I say create, I'm talking about living words, right? The way that Lynn identifies this question of living words. When you say Hamlet, the word Hamlet, let's get away from Athena, right? Did you ever meet Hamlet? No, right? But he's a living concept for you if you've worked through the problem. Now, for the early Greeks, right, what Homer was doing was resurrecting this idea of a goddess of justice and wisdom, which Aeschylus picks up, right? So he's, in a sense, developing the idea further. So therefore, that's what I mean by creating. I mean, she existed before and had an interesting history before. But in this poem, and then later Aeschylus is picking it up, and later Sophocles picking it up, for Athens itself, they deepen it. That's what I'm referring to.
Okay, so did the living word, the principles of Athena, I know that they had some sort of an influence on the American Revolution, but can you give me any leads as to, where to look as far as, how she kind of got ready?
Well, it's an interesting. If you read the debates in the on the Constitution of the United States, there's a very interesting rejection of Roman law. Right? They explicitly reject this idea of a Roman Senate. This idea that an oligarchy should rule, they reject all this stuff. And in a sense, it's not directly Palace-Athene, but this idea of Plato in the Republic was explicitly discussed in the Constitutional Convention by several. And they came up with a very interesting resolution of the problem. They said, well, look, there's an idea of checks and balances, right? That while the majority cannot oppress the minority, certainly the minority can't oppress the majority. And therefore you had to create the basis upon which the best types of decisions could be made, and given the most time for the debate and the discussion. But that, in fact, the principles are identified in the preamble to the Constitution. But there's no direct reference to Athena in that.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
You have a question in Seattle here?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Tobiah. Up here in the Northwest, we kind of have this big existential crowd.
Yeah.
And a lot of these Nietzscheites. And I don't want to speak for the whole local, but I picked up sort of this, so it's kind of rubbed off on me. So I've been struggling with the whole idea of poetry and geometry, and I'm kind of getting that connection.
Right.
But you talked about tonight science and art being separated, and this is what Nietzsche does.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, I kind of get it, but I was wondering if you could kind of expound on the idea of the connection of science as a form of art.
Well, there's a very interesting discussion. It was called the two cultures problem. in the 1950s, where there was a guy by the name of C.P. Snow wrote a book called The Two Cultures, in which they found that the scientists couldn't talk to the artists and the artists couldn't talk to the scientists, right? They found that science was going in one direction and art was going in another direction. And while C.P. Snow is very well-meaning, by the way, he doesn't defend this kind of thing. But what he identifies is the fact that there were no unifying principles between art and science. There was no view in science that the social process of creating ideas was critical to the advancement of mankind. And there was no idea in the artists that they should know any universal principles. Any universal principle, electricity, anything, right? Therefore, they couldn't talk to each other. And what Lin develops in the next 50 years, and constantly is developing, is that the compositional method, both in discovery of science and the creation of valid art, is based upon the same impulse tendency. And that if you do not have that same impulse tendency, then you won't do art and you won't do science. You may fiddle around, right? You may come up with something that might be pleasing, right? But you will not discover anything. And that this is very much what Lin identifies as the question of cognition. That in the art, it's the social process of communicating ideas, right? Valid scientific ideas. That's what art does. In the scientific process, it's the discovery of those new universal principles. But you don't have a language when you first discover a new universal principle, because it didn't exist before. So how the hell do you communicate an idea that never existed before if it's a valid discovery? But it's based upon valid discovery, and it's based upon increasing the powers of mankind. If it's not that, if it doesn't increase the relative potential population density of mankind, it's not an idea. You may think it's an idea. It may have some formality of an idea, but it's not an idea. It has to, as Vernadsky says, man is a tangible geological force. But once you make that discovery, you have to communicate it, and you have to create the language by which you can communicate it. So that's the relationship between the two. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Just a couple of announcements. We've got a Monge Brigade tomorrow for contacts. Starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, goes till 3. We also have a cadre school coming up at the end of April. That's going to be a weekend seminar, I think, in Santa Barbara, which we go more in depth into some of these ideas. So you can sign up for that tonight if you want to in the room. We also have a Gauss marathon starting at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. It'll be for the next about 8-9 days. Each evening we'll be working through Gauss's paper. And for those who are interested in working on it, I've got a small packet of quotes by Lin on why the paper is significant, as well as a short translation of a paper that Gauss wrote around the notion of number. So if you're interested in working on the marathon, just come talk to me afterwards, and then just have general discussion.